Okay, one of the most famous that one will come across is that the Torah begins and ends with Chesed, which in and of itself is a long discussion, of course. And you can find it in Leviticus, love thy neighbor as thyself, or in Micah, he has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God. And then from Pirkei Avot, another very well-known quote is, the world rests upon three things: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, or loving kindness. And that from the Talmud, tzedakah and acts of kindness are equivalent to all of the mitzvot of the Torah. And then finally, as for citations, is upon the practice of Chesed, as it is written, the world will be built through kindness. So there's a lot of emphasis in, obviously, in different parts and experiences, all ancient to varying degrees. And then what is also notable that I came across are disciplines such as Musar, which is really a if you're not familiar with it, a kind of self-reflection, self-improvement, character development discipline, Kabbalah, in which Chesed is discussed. And then the ultimate goal, of course, which several commentators mention, is something called imitatio Dei, or the imitation of God. So that being godly really requires being kind. And to make the distinction between Chesed and tzedakah, you can find some reference to it in Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, and this is Maimonides as for reference purpose, where I'm pretty sure most, if not all, are familiar with the origin of the word tzedakah. So the charity is really an act of justice, and that it was really, as Maimonides expands upon it, a measured giving of what is due. And that would be, a 10% or maybe 20% obligation. And it was considered an obligation to take care of the poor and the needy. Chesed, he distinguished, is actually an expansion of tzedakah. It applies to caring for all people, whether they're poor or they're rich. And it goes beyond social justice to a free-flowing giving of the Spirit. So to round this out in some more Jewish perspectives, and two of my favorite quotes on the subject, from the first from Isaac Bashevis Singer, kindness, I have discovered, is everything in life. And the other from Anne Frank, where no one has ever become poor by giving. So kindness, though, while it's rich in the Jewish tradition is rich with it and emphasizes it in so many different ways, it's really, though, a universal quality. If you look across languages, every single language has a word for kindness. The graphic on this slide is from our a poster that we had made as regards Envision, with just some of the many examples that that are available. And one of the other features related to this universal quality is, if you look at almost every religion, certainly every major religion, it talks about the importance of kindness. They all espouse kindness. Buddhism very prominently, and they have a word for it, metta, which you probably have heard, or Christianity with agape, and I believe in Hinduism it is karuna. So it's a universal quality that's emphasized by cultures, religions, different people everywhere. So it begs a question, and I've encountered this as I've had this journey through the world of kindness and talking to people about it. And one of the first questions which I'm intending to answer with you today is kindness a moral, meaning a cognitive or conscious quality, Or is it innate? Or maybe it's both. But a lot of people have trouble thinking about kindness, particularly in a world that is driven by selfishness, ego, violence, and a lot of things that were portrayed, and in fact, and Darwin misquoted, etc. And so that negativity is the dominant force or characteristic of humankind. And that kindness is kind of like a nice add-on. And I'm going to try to dispel that and address with you the basic nature of living beings, with the emphasis, of course, on kindness. So I'm going to reframe this in a way and say, if we start, if you will, from the top and think about it in an evolutionary and biologic terms, and what the drivers of nature would be to help think about kindness in a different way. Now, when I talk about nature, of course, it's easy to, for anyone who wants to substitute God is for nature, the notion of creation. As a scientist, I refer to it as that, but I acknowledge this, and so that you would feel free to think about it in the perspective that matters most to you. But either way, the way of nature is to promote life. It's to promote survival. Everything that nature does, the retention of characteristics, is to allow organisms and really species to survive. So to promote life, nature has to promote caring, because caring allows for organisms to help each other survive. So what I'm going to put forward to you, and it's not just mine alone, is that kindness is really an innate quality. Nature wanted us to be kind to one another, to connect in a positive way. That's what this whole story is really about. And that kindness and caring for others is key to survival. And I'll come back to Darwin's comment in a minute. And we're really wired. Our brains, our bodies are wired to respond to kindness. And I'll show you how. And that the biology and psychology of all of this has a lot of import. It affects survival, so life or death. It affects things like mate selection. It affects stress reduction and healing. And then I'm going to turn and talk about how to promote kindness on a population scale in an unbiased way. So to start off, we are wired to be kind. So looking at this system as like we were all putting on a hat that we're evolutionary psychologists, and we're talking about maximizing survival of the species, that kindness is required in a variety of different ways. A very easy way to think about it is required for nurturing of the young. So if humankind was only interested in self-survival, then when a newborn comes into the world, the mother would be driven to actually tend to itself, because after all, care of the newborn, sacrifice for food, defense against predators are all risks that the mother takes. So she must pay attention, as well as in many species, the father of the offspring. And this is the notion of kin, right? Which actually is the origin of the word kind, and also related to the Old English as an aside for the word nice. If you study toddlers, there's another example. And each of these, by the way, are talks unto themselves. These are what I'm sharing with you is a compilation of multiple studies. So if you look at toddlers, and in the study, the investigator drops a pencil or a pen, and that person watches and records what the toddler does. Naturally, the toddler usually picks up the object and hands it back to the investigator. In other words, the toddler already knows this. In infants, particularly from a professor by the name of Paul Bloom at Yale, he argues that you can see this also, where infants show a preference for those characters in different scenarios that are kind. And then finally, if you look at non-human species, so if you look at non-human primates or ants, bats, rats, it doesn't really matter. You can find this in multiple species. Animals will sacrifice for each other or call out to help each other or do this without any concept of reward. So how would this come about? In other words, if you had to think about engineering the brain mechanisms to get people and then all these other species to connect and care for each other. And one way to think about it is a pleasure-pain principle. Remember, we go towards pleasurable things and we go away from pain. So we don't want our hand to be burned, so we avoid heat, and don't put our hand on a hot stove or object. And then we seek things that provide us with comfort, whether that's warmth, etc. So it turns out that being connected to others, of course, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, feels good. And what I'd want you to do to, amongst yourselves is think about positive relationships that you have. Family, friends, somebody else, it doesn't really matter. And then think about how you felt after you've helped someone, perhaps one of those people, or even a stranger. And if you come up like as many people would, with a feeling of what the psychologists call elevation, and literally the term describes it, you feel good, you feel light, you feel a warmth in the chest, maybe a sense of relaxation. That's elevation. It also had been called more colloquially the helper's high, and you'll see why in a second. Pain, on the other hand, wants us, right, to stay away from something that could be untoward. Well, it turns out that in addition to physical injury like heat or falling, etc., loneliness, of course, is a very painful circumstance. And so is losing another one. In other words, disconnection. So nature is driving us to be social individuals, which is why social isolation, either for the elderly or anyone else, or people who are in isolation in prison, is a painful event, and people will describe it just like that. So these mechanisms are there, and they're there to drive us towards connecting with one another. The physiology is complicated. There's a lot to it. And I'm going to just gloss over these. Again, this is another entire talk unto itself. But there are things that we're given or built in that allow us to respond, to understand what other people are feeling, literally to connect with them, right, and have empathy, and then to act on them. And so these neurologic systems go everything from interpretation of facial expression and body language. So an open, gentle hand or a smile or a warm embrace and a light touch all convey connection. We're connected to another, and the giver cares about the receiver. But we have to be born, we have to have the mechanisms in place to be able to recognize that smile is something good. And that open hand is a friendly gesture versus a closed hand or a fist is an act of aggression. These are things that are built in for survival. Then we need the mechanism to say, not only do I know what that is, but I can then put myself in that person's shoes. And that's what empathy is a skill that we would have to be able to do so. Altruism is taking that skill, taking the ability to recognize empathy and the willingness than to drive it to act upon it. So empathy is the feeling, and the act of kindness, and I can talk about kindness versus altruism, but the intent is translating it back into what that person might need. And then finally, allowing us to feel what someone else is feeling and to share it and spread it is something called emotional contagion. So if I'm happy, the odds that you're going to be happy rise. And similarly, if I'm sad or I'm angry, the odds that that is going to be transferred or contagious, if you will, and this stuff is highly contagious, will also rise. So you can see some of these things, a lot of these experiments, if you will, or experiments of nature, arise because people have injury, tumors, they had surgery in specific areas, and then these qualities are lost. There are also hormonal systems, and you may have heard of something called oxytocin. It's also colloquially called the love hormone, and that's intimately related to how, for example, the mother bonds with the baby. It also decreases the response to stressors, and we're going to talk a bit about stress in a minute, and it promotes social behavior. And then finally, there are mechanisms that induce endorphin and endocannabinoid release, essentially opioid-like molecules, and endocannabinoids, those that the active ingredients in marijuana affect, both of them are released as part of the process to reinforce reward systems. So how about in other ways? Well, it turns out kindness also affects mate selection, or another way of saying it is nice guys don't finish last. And I'll give you some examples of this. And you know, a lot of people place emphasis, and particularly in a very culture that we have now that tends often towards the more superficial, that physical attractiveness is important, but so is kindness. And it turns out that, and these are studies that have been done in largely heterosexual populations, and usually women are the respondents looking at men. That's usually the setup here. If a woman is looking at a test description of a male that she would be interested in, different types of relationships, a one-night stand, a short-term relationship, a romantic, long-term, etc. It turns out that the quality of being described as being generous overwhelmingly favors her selection of that man as a partner. If I take a picture of a guy, let's say we're creating a dating app, and I put that picture up and I put 3 descriptors, you know, he's 26, he's, you know, works as this, and he loves video games. And I have the same picture, he's 26, he works at this, and he volunteers at the local food bank or works in a summer camp with disabled children. The viewers of his photograph will rate him as more physically attractive in the second profile than in the first. Conversely, men, these are again heterosexual men who are being watched by women, and they know they're being watched, and in different settings, will be more generous than if they are either not watched or that they're on some neutral camera and they have no idea who is watching them. So the way that evolutionary psychologists put this is that this has evolved for mate selection, that the person, the man who is cares for others is the one who will most likely stick around with the family and support the family. So there are a lot of different thinkers on kindness, and I've included this, and I'll do it briefly, really to say to you, there are some misconceptions. The first one is about Darwin. While Darwin wrote in his first book on the origin of the species about natural selection, which gave rise from someone else named Herbert Spencer to survival of the fittest, he actually wrote in his second book, The Descent of Man, that communities that included the most sympathetic or altruistic members would flourish best. So he recognized that this was a problem. On the far side is William Hamilton, English geneticist, who showed the genetics of this with something called inclusive fitness or kin selection, meaning that I know we're related, and therefore, and that attraction, that genetic relationship gets me to help those that are more related to myself than I would otherwise be. Again, refuting the point that we're just egotistical machine, that's about all we know how to do, and the rest is just an add-on. The last in the middle is the father of capitalism, is Adam Smith. And although many people are most familiar with his book, The Wealth of Nations, which is the treatise on capitalism, his first book was A Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which Smith was recognizing that there's what he called an inner voice. We might call it a conscience, an inclination, a drive, that knows that we're all connected and that we have to act in accord with it and help each other. So how does this all affect health? And that's where I became really interested in more into what kindness could do. It's very hard to measure kindness, of course. I'm sure all of you do multiple acts of kindness each day, whether that's even a courtesy call, a smile, a nice note, that kind of thing. But if you look at the literature on volunteerism and epidemiologic studies, it's stuck out to me. I just took a hard look at this, that in these studies, people who volunteered regularly had death rates that are 20 to 40% lower than non-volunteers. Now, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but let me give you some perspective. If we took two communities and inoculated one against measles and left the other one uninoculated, and there was a measles outbreak, the death rate reduction from the vaccinations about 15%. If we take a community and that has contaminated water and go to clean water, the reduction in death rate often is around 20 or so %. So although volunteerism is much more complicated than those two other scenarios, this is a big deal. It says pay attention, because there's something that's very important in here. The short end of this is that it's likely stress reduction through connection, and it's very well established that social support buffers stress. Buffering means you don't get as much of a response to it. So you're probably familiar that people have a lot of stress, particularly now with COVID. But it's always been bad. Even before COVID, the United States was tied for 4th place in the world amongst the most stressed countries in the world. And by the way, the tie was with Iran, Algeria, and Sri Lanka. And there are a lot of reasons, and everybody has their own, and everybody has some degree of stress. The real big issue with stress is that it affects quality of life, right? It can cause or worsen disease, and I'm going to show you a list in a second, but those are mental and physical diseases. And that workplace stress is epidemic, and I'll show you some statistics about that. And of course, it's been amplified by COVID-19. So here's a list for both mental illnesses and physical illnesses. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read them, but it's widespread. And it underpins so much pathophysiology, the cause of disease that happens. Stress also increases the risk of major infection. So that it is exemplified in different studies, but if you look at people who've been infected with HIV and their progression to AIDS, the people who are stressed have a much more rapid progression. It also raises the possibility of what is happening with COVID-19. And so, but what I'd like to do is just trying to summarize this, and it's what I call a vicious cycle, where people start off having stressors, right? We mix up we often overlap the words stress and stressor and stress response. So the stressor is, I'm short on money. My finances are in trouble. The stress response is how I react to that. The stress response here, which is common to every living being really, is that there's a sympathetic nervous system activation and there's inflammation that can occur acutely. Even if I ask somebody to get up and give a talk in front of people or do math problems, this can be invoked and you can see changes. On the backdrop of who they are and how long this stressor goes or stress response goes on for, their own resources, the environment, their genetics, all that comes together to create disease, as well as affect behavior like drug use, diet, smoking, exercise, etc. And when you pull this together, that goes to decreased quality of life and survival. This is a vicious cycle because all of these things, right, create new stressors or worsen the stress response. And so what I used to tell medical students and residents is the worse it gets, the worse it gets. And of course, the opposite is true. So this is what it looks like of workplace stress. Let's put it this way, it's pretty bad. At least a third of workers have either high or unsustainably high stress. And why does this matter? Well, you know, stress life is stressful, right? You could just chalk it up to that. Well, it's associated with greater than 120,000 deaths per year in the United States. Its cost in the United States, and we had to put it in dollar terms, and others have done that, it's $200 to $300 billion. In the EU, it's been estimated at 600 billion euros. It's expensive. It also, in the workplace, causes absenteeism, presenteeism, great word, meaning I'm sitting there, but I'm not in here, I'm not here, and worker turnover. And this is a more complex slide, but it's just touching on it because it acknowledges that ultimately everyone is searching for purpose and meaning. And purpose and meaning also, as a higher level, come from being connected. You care about me, I care about you, therefore I have purpose. You give meaning to my life. This is Maslow's pyramid. Maslow was an early 20th century psychologist. And the point that I'm making here is based on Maslow's work and Viktor Frankl, who you have likely heard of, who was a Holocaust survivor and wrote Man's Search for Meaning. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. This cartoon tries to summarize the entire, what I've called the secret sauce of kindness, is that if you think about it, kindness creates this reward of the helper's high. The recipient feels valued. It creates a connection between the two of them, which results in health and happiness and meaning. They also, because we mimic behaviors of each other, tend to pay it forward, and this cycle can become virtuous by now allowing it to propagate. There are disconnectors, of course, that I've listed here, and I'm happy to talk about this if there's time. So there are allied concepts to kindness. I'm not going to get into each of these. They're talks unto themselves. With altruism, I briefly mentioned compassion, empathy, gratitude, right, is the appreciation of kindness. For forgiveness, if you actually take apart that word into its syllables, and volunteerism. Each of these are very related, and I put them under the umbrella of the word kindness, but one could easily see just shifting that arrangement. They're all talking about the same thing, which is connection. So kindness is a natural antidote to stress. It's a path to meaning and purpose. And of course, it's that path for whomever the person is, whoever the giver is. So what could it do in the workplace? Well, you could imagine if there are all these disconnectors, You can reconnect people and affect negative behaviors like bullying and aggression, positive behaviors like teamwork, caring for internal and external customers, providing meaning to somebody's work, or even existence in day to day, all to decrease stress and foster meaning and decrease turnover. And these things have been shown to increase productivity. There's a well-known study from a Coca-Cola plant in Spain that showed how that could be done. So how about what else do we know about the neuropsychology of it? Well, it turns out that in addition to doing kindness or being part of it in its experience, simply seeing it has a lot of the same positive and beneficial effects. It generates this reward response, it builds trust, and it also helps explain how kindness spreads. I do want to just mention about the negative piece, and so that you don't think that I've discounted it. Does any of this exclude a strong self-interest drive? And the short answer is no, of course it doesn't. The drive to survive, remember, you're all evolutionary psychologists now. The drive to survive demands self-interest. I have to take care of myself. I have to feed myself. I have to do things that are healthy. I have to go to work and provide. All of these things demand some self-interest. When it gets carried too far is when things get out of control. So egoism and selfishness, exaggerated selfishness and conflict. And part of that, of course, is fueled by the fact that we have a very individualistic and materialistic culture. And that media amplifies this, and particularly amplifies the polarization of society. But if I left you with anything, it's the actions of living beings are a malleable balance between self-preservation and self-sacrifice or other preservation. Oh, and I didn't put on who this is, but this is Thomas Hobbes, who is the 17th century philosopher whose seminal work, Leviathan, really said, people aren't so great. They're pretty self-interested at heart, and you need an absolute autocrat to, essentially a benevolent autocrat to even things out. But the real challenge is how do you uplift people and promote kindness and do it regularly? And you don't require in our busy world training or time, but you also don't want to lecture people. Nobody, the righteous approach is tough to support for long term. But there are two ways, of course, and those approaches is what I'm getting at. The first one is the shaming, rule creation, or outrage. We've got a lot of outrage lately, obviously, in the world. And then there's a modeling approach. So shaming or rule creation is really to create guideposts, give people sort of minimum, don't do this. And it's the 10 Commandments, right, is mostly don't do this, right, as we run through the list. And it's associated, of course, with, well, what would happen if I did that? It's a fear of punishment. That punishment could be simple, ridicule, or could be ostracism, which is can be very painful. It could be with a promise of a reward. There could be a carrot in there, of course, but it generally will not create bonding. It would generally be polarizing, and from my perspective can worsen disconnection and distrust if there are accusations and counter accusations. And as when we open the front page of almost any news site, it's what dominates. Violation of the rules and shaming. The other way is modeling. And so in this case, modeling is associated with something called priming and mimicry. These are subconscious as well as conscious, but really subconscious processes. In other words, I can prime you with something. For an example is you see a picture of food and you may be hungry. You see certain shapes or whatever, and you may be thinking around those shapes. And when someone asks to guess a shape, that's, wow, They guessed it right. But it's all about priming. And so modeling can also create in unto its own self a social acceptance and a new norm. So about 7 years ago, a little bit longer than I started thinking about this problem, and it started because I was stressed and having a reaction to the news. That was almost a decade ago. And thought about, well, what could we do to help people rebalance what I call the visual diet? And with the help of my eldest son, Jesse, whom some of you may know, we put together this nonprofit. And the intent is to use images because the brain interprets images very quickly because people don't want to read anything anymore. Images are transcultural. So whether you're looking at this image of a young Filipino girl and a newborn puppy, and if you're in Japan or you're in Europe or you're in South America, it doesn't really matter. You get the idea pretty quickly. And this has been shown by a variety of psychologists. So we chose to use images to promote this concept of kindness, compassion, love, and joy. And the intent is really to reduce stress, to help people connect better with others and themselves, with their own humanity, without shame, without any trying to persuade anyone, no judgments, just showing. We did 2 studies. This is the results from the first study that we did. This is 400 people. They were assigned to randomize into groups of 100 to look at different types of images. I won't go through every single one of this because it'll take too long. But essentially, this group were standard images that came from a set that psychologists have used for years. Positive images are the most important to think about here. Typical go-tos: puppies in a basket, bunnies, flowers, even a mother and child. The kindness images weren't so pretty, though. A woman in distress on a dark stairwell being helped comforted by a police officer. A sea of shaven heads with one face looking up. It's a young man going for chemotherapy, and his friends shave their heads in support of him. What we found blew my mind. And it also was very impressive to the psychologists who helped us do this study. The response to the kindness images was about double that of the pretty images in inducing joy and gratitude. These aren't shown. Hope and optimism, love and trust, soaring increases in compassion, near a doubling of this baseline, so almost 100%. And they were very inspired. And kindness images also, we measured negative emotions, sadness, anger, fear, etc. And these people were pretty happy at baseline, but kindness images, unlike the positives, decreased irritation and anger. This study said to me, now really pay attention because this is very important. There's something that's so critical in how the people respond to these. And it opened up now new possibilities because how the images could be used on a widespread basis. So what we decided to do is take the media and put it into video format and stream it into more stressful environments. And we're focused on healthcare settings, but there are lots of, stressful environments or environments in which you'd actively want people to be able to relate to each other better. And remember, this isn't just about being kind, like smiling and say, "Hi, Joe." It's about, because kindness leads to, if we're connected, we cooperate with each other. We collaborate with each other. We're not arguing as much because it's not about our ego, since we're connected to one another. So corporations, schools, people who've looked at our content talk about prisons, other places, a variety of places. And what you'll see in a lot of the images that you may have noticed as I've gone along are from our portfolio, which come from thousands of, there are thousands of images from hundreds of photographers in about 120 countries. Our objectives in healthcare are really to shift that medical care, emotional and spiritual environment. I mean, patients come in And even if they're healthy, there's always that nagging concern. Will they find something? Will he say something untoward to me? Will something go wrong here? And when, like, can I get out of here? And so, and imagine now there's the room, and you've all been in this situation, I'm sure, and there's a room and people are having, there's tension, and it may be just mild, but it's shared amongst those folks, and it's shared with the staff. So this is not a simple thing. But what if we could lift all of these people up and let this relax and have them find more joy in that moment, so that when the patient goes into the room, the encounter is much more satisfying for everyone. The doc listens more because doctors interrupt in a median time of within 11 seconds of visit. And patients usually lie, or excuse me, don't tell the truth or fully disclose information. It's been cited about 86% of the time. Now, one of the ways that we also know that patients are very stressed is there's something called white coat hypertension, where blood pressure goes up when the person's in the room and you try to let them sit and then they go down. Well, that's based on a diagnostic criterion of hypertension, but it's a sign that so many others are probably also experiencing stress. So we know that this is there. This is not a secret. It's what can we do about it that's easy and passive. So we took this kindness media, which we call Inspire, and we studied it in a pediatric, it's a healthcare setting, a dentist's office, actually in East Lyme. And what we did is compared it against the children's commercial television that they showed. And so either parents and staff were randomized to see the children's commercial television or a few minutes of Inspire. And then we asked basic things, and it was a much more limited list than the previous study because this is a busy setting, right? People are coming and going, filling out forms, watching their kids. We couldn't do an extensive questionnaire, but it was still very solid. On the right is a score called, we call it the mean inspiration score. And by the way, this study was done with 3 academic psychologists who specialize in media impact. The standard or children's media really didn't affect viewers. One is little or none at all in terms of inspiration. 5 is the maximum score. So what you can see is that people were markedly moved and uplifted. On individual other items, they were happier, they were calmer, they were more grateful, and they were also more generous. There was test method that was said, well, everyone was going to get a $5 gift card for participating. And at the end of the study, they were asked or offered, if you will, the opportunity that if they wanted to, they could claim their card, or if they wanted to donate it, they could donate it to a needy family. And about 60% more people donated their cards to that needy family who watched Inspire than those who watched the children's commercial television. And I'd call that kind of television more neutral content. It had some elements that were uplifting, but it was probably neutral as a fair description. And this effect occurs within minutes. But it's not just our study. If you go look back at the kindness literature in media impact, it's supported by academicians who did this in more laboratory settings, and they used commercial clips. There are a handful of them, the most common being a short clip from an Oprah show. And they also saw lots of increase in happiness, or remember that term, elevation. And they also saw the willingness to donate. In other words, seeing this is an image of a mother accepting, obviously you could see the US flag from a soldier her son had died, is that it shows up in terms of either offering time for the willingness to volunteer or offering money. What's also notable and very relevant to today is that this, what's called a self-other difference, that if we're connected to each other, the more we're connected, this self-other distinction collapses, it decreases. Well, it turns out that that's true for people of other races. So even if I'm not showing, if I'm just showing kindness content, but it's not, for example, of a family that's, or people that are Black, the willingness to donate to a Black charity rises significantly. Others in Scandinavia have done something similar in what they call elevation, what others call elevation, they call something called kama mutta. And in that case, it's about dehumanization. And for them, it's related to, for example, Pakistanis in Scandinavia. So this works. This is not, this is multiple labs. It shows itself in multiple ways. And it really, because media is so disseminatable, raises incredible possibility, at least in my view. So these have been published. I also published recently an article in a medical journal on kindness as a stress reduction, health promotion intervention, which explains a lot of what I've told you in a bit greater detail. And this is the reference to the study in the pediatric dentist's office. So the take home is that the media can positively change how people feel and behave in real world settings. And then there are other benefits. So there are benefits for organizations who want to make a statement about kindness and compassion as being important. It's quick and it's passive. So there are a lot of, in healthcare, doctors and nurses are undergoing training to improve the way they communicate. An important part of this training is to try to increase compassion, because it's known that not based on the doctor's skill set, like how smart he or she is, but it's actually based on whether or not the patient trusts the doctor, is that they will follow the doctor's recommendations. So whatever could be done to help the patient and the doc bridge those gaps would be huge. But they're all running about, right? Everybody's busy. They're overloaded with work. So beyond also a potential resistance, so not make this cognitive, what if we just put it in the background? Like that advertising. And I've joked about this is advertising for kindness without necessarily being so explicit. But it also turns out that there's a compendium of a book that came out last year called Compassionomics, that when physicians are more compassionate, their outcomes are better and the economics is markedly improved, the costs of care, et cetera. Why? Because they're more actively listening probably, and they're checking on the patient, and the patient is following recommendations. There's a give and take here that is very important. There are also multiple other applications even within medicine. So promoting this, to me, is, I've gone through a lot of this, but has a lot of advantages. It's subconscious, so there's no moralizing. We don't want to tell anyone that they're wrong or they're bad. We want to just help them find a way to be better. Now, it also creates a ripple. So we've talked about this contagion thing. So now imagine the content, media is dropping in for people, and the content is being viewed, and then those people go out and maybe they hold the door for somebody else. Maybe they smile or say hello to someone else. Maybe they don't even say something negative, or maybe they do something that's even, grander than those things. Others not only experience that, but they also, there are going to be people who see it. And remember, it's seeing it that's also clutch. So they go out, they're now exposed, and then it expands. It ripples outwards. And you've probably heard the expression, the ripple of kindness, but this is I'm trying to give some detail to explaining how that would happen. So in this setting, people become the change agents. And the relevance to social issues we've talked a bit about, but it has lots of relevance to bullying and ostracism, to collaboration. All of these are negatives, And I don't really like to frame things in the negative, but to put it in perspective, they yield a lot of potential power because it's subconscious, because it ripples outwards. So you can make a virtuous cycle out of this, or a more virtuous cycle, and create resilience. This is the essence, one of the ways to create wellness. And then, of course, because it's media, it poses the ability to do this on a population scale. So it really becomes about public health. And this is a teacher also in the Far East. I'm sorry, I don't remember the country. It might be Malaysia, teaching sign language. And so it opens the possibility for collaboration and cooperation and a higher quality of life, and lower workplace stress and affect racism, social division, and health. It's easy to deploy through something called digital signage technology. It's actually pretty simple. These advances have been made. And if you want to see what this looks like on our site, there's something called a demo reel. You're welcome to see. So if you want to get involved with it, I welcome that, because this is not about me. This is about really, it's going to take, a lot of people getting involved to a degree of just seeing it and wanting to advocate for it. So we have the usuals, of course. There's social media. We publish a newsletter. I've been writing a blog that's been published in Psychology Today called The Science of Kindness. That was actually a lot of the genesis for this. We're a nonprofit, so donations count for us. And the more that happens, the more we can do. There's your own advocacy. People talking about it is great and much appreciated. And if there are healthcare practices that are interested, we're rolling out low-cost subscriptions just to let people know the digital signage. And if there are non-healthcare workplaces, I want to study it. My interest is not studying it for an academician's perspective. While I used to be a professor at a medical school, I'm not an academician anymore. My intent is, the studies are to help people to quantify its impact and help people see it, rather than just talk about kindness as a squishy kumbaya kind of thing, but also to learn from it and to figure out, okay, how do we do this better? Because we need to do the best that we can to help people. But whatever you do, what I always advise people is do the kind things that you like to do. And the reason for advocating for that is that they're the most sustainable. They will provide you with joy and meaning and purpose. And there's no greater gift than that. And so to recapitulate, nature wants us to survive. Kindness is that innate quality to help facilitate it and promote wellness. Connection is the central outcome from kindness. Kindness can be promoted just by simply seeing it, and it has much relevance to living a higher quality life. And as Hillel said, paraphrasing him, the rest is detail. So I'm ending with another quote. We also make our own original art, and there are lots of different pieces that you'll see in the demo reel. And that compassionate people are geniuses in the art of living, more necessary to the dignity, security, and joy of humanity than the discoverers of knowledge. And so with that, let me stop. I see we're just at about under an hour, and so Ella or Kathleen, if you want, have any questions, I'm open to.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I have to leave in 4 minutes, but I don't want to shut down the conversation, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So I would just invite anyone that has a question to just unmute and ask their question. Well, looks like we have a lot of shy people tonight. Ella has
I have
question.
a question. Could you put the website for the demo reel again, or could you just say that again?
If you go to Envision Kindness, envisionkindness.org, or if you search my name, it'll come up too. And then the page is called Nspire, E-N-S-P-I-R-E. It's under a programs tab.
Thank you.
Sure.
Have you tried to promote these things with smaller communities? I'm thinking congregations, elderly people living in assisted living, to see how it elongates or improves their lives. I know that there are so many little things that do that, like putting a little pot on the windowsill, a plant, or goldfish. So did you ever try to apply that to these systems?
Not yet. It's a very good point. So two things. One is COVID broke out. We were in discussions with some hospitals and other settings, and everything changed, of course. But you also raise another point that's worth sharing with folks, is that seeing nature in and of itself also has potent relaxing effects. It doesn't necessarily increase this sense of elevation unless it's a very special aspect. But there are a lot of studies looking at either putting a plant in the room, or fish, as you said, or with a companion animal, or going for a walk in the woods. And even images of nature can activate in the brain internal mechanisms that allow for calm and relaxation to occur. So I'm very interested in nursing homes. There are reasons to think about why this would be beneficial for the elderly on several different accounts. I welcome suggestions.
Maybe even in hospitals, to see how not having kindness towards them, but patients that can get out of bed and do kindness towards others can be a win-win situation.
Oh, absolutely. And in that's part of our focus. So it's offices and hospitals. So it also, what you'll see when you look at the demo reel, is that it only has a supportive music track. It's otherwise silent. Any information is rendered textually. So everything is visual. And the reason for that is that there would be a lot of noise and other sounds. And so we didn't want to create more stress by competing with that. So it's intended for hospitals and clinic settings and airports. There are a variety of places that it could be used. Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and I hope you all have a good night. From my own perspective, this is the first talk I did. I've done the science of kindness before, but combining Chesed as an intro, and I personally really enjoyed putting that piece in with it. So
I'd like to say one thing as an observer. The world needs more like you. I'm certainly greatly impressed, and I wonder why and maybe it's my own ignorance, have not heard of all your good work before. And is there something we can do to help spread it? I know you mentioned it, but in a very practical sense, The world should know a lot more about the good stuff you do.
I'd be happy to talk about it. It's a lot of this, we're virtual. And what you're hearing is plowing a road that just doesn't exist until, what we're doing. If there was a model that I would have been able to follow, I would have gladly done that and supported the mission of an organization doing this kind of thing. So in terms of awareness, talk to people about it, tell your friends. If you use social media, great. If you want to subscribe to our newsletter, great. If you can, people want to support us, it's always an interesting position to be saying, yes, we're a nonprofit and we run on donations and grants. And then any of the other ideas that I put in, recommendations to other practices that might be interested in trying out the content. It's really about people using it. So we're also creating PSAs that will be broadcast on mainstream television. There are a variety of things that we're trying, and largely, I see the world as suffering unnecessarily so much. And there's so much that could be done to lessen that. So I welcome suggestions, and thank you for asking. Oh, Rena, you're on mute.
I have to lead the minion, but I just loved your talk. I'm so proud of you and your wife and your kids and all the good stuff you do for other people. Keep it up and stay healthy.
Thank you. Thank you. And back at you. So I don't want to hold you all up.